Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is approximately coming up about 5 minutes past the hour at 5 o'clock on the East Coast, and it has been a beautiful, beautiful sunny day in the great state of Georgia. I had to step out earlier to get some things done, but I wanted to go and film this before the day is done because today's been a pretty exciting day, at least for the nation, as we are still trying to understand all of the things that are happening between Elon Musk's Doge requests for federal workers basically to justify your existence. Um, and I have a couple comments about that. First of all, Mr. Musk, Elon, if I may, um, I think you're a little bit out of line on this one, and here's the reason why. I know that you represent the President of the United States, but so do these federal workers. And I think that if we want the bureaucracy to respond, they are not going to respond to you. You can make the request, but as I've said, I know the FBI, I think some members in state, they said they wanted to handle that. And I think that you have to respect that as much as you want. I would continue in your efforts to try to find fraud, waste, and abuse, and I think you're going to find plenty. And you haven't even touched the mother lode with the Department of Defense. And I think that you should to use the word, I think that should be the very next target that you need to go after because I think you're going to find a mother load of waste and abuse. But to tell people to try to justify their existence only after a week's work, I think that's a little bit out of line. But again, that's just me talking. What I wanted to do is I wanted to address and call this particular segment Call to Serve. The reason why is that I have two plaques on my desk. I just recently got one, and let me show them to you. It's the plaque on the left is from John Kennedy. This is what a plaque he had in the Oval Office. Oh God, thy sea is so great, and thy boat is so small. And obviously, being a former naval officer and having his boat literally shared in half by a Japanese destroyer, the PT-109, and then rescuing his men and getting them back. I'm sure there are plenty of times that he was out at sea, and to just have that idea go through that, in retrospect, we are just a tiny, tiny speck in the greater part of God's creation, but yet we were created in God's image. The one on the right is from Ronald Reagan, and basically there is no limit of what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. The reason why I like this particular plaque so much is that when I was commissioned on commissioning day at the Air Force Academy, May 30th, 1984, we were getting out of our cadet uniforms and getting on our officer uniforms for the first time, and I'd been packed up and my family was ready for me, so I kind of made my way down to the bottom of the ramp. Now, the parade ramp goes from the terrazzo, which is an upper level. You go through this ramp, and then you go down another ramp to the parade field. But back then, they had a poem, and it was called Bring Me Men. And the poem was, bring me men to match my mountains. Bring me men to match my plains. Bring me men to match my mountains in new eras and in new dreams. Well, obviously with the integration of Cadet Wing, it was changed. Now it's like excellence for all or whatever. They just changed it. But the ramp that I knew, that was the ramp. Well, at the base of the ramp was a very senior NCO. He was one of the chief master sergeants that was actually assigned to working with the Cadet Wing. And, cadets do not salute non-commissioned officers, but obviously things had changed, and I was a commissioned officer, and therefore he was required to salute me. But I say that with very little haughtiness. Okay, yes, it was a regulation, but I would have saluted him for all of the work that he had done both with me individually and with some of my classmates. But the whole point was is that he said, "Sir, can I give you one last bit of advice?" I said, "Chief, absolutely. I will always take your advice." And back then, we didn't have our business cards printed out. We had no internet. We just had the phone system. And I wish I had kept in touch with him. But he gave me a great piece of advice. And he said, "Sir, remember that credit is like a large chocolate bar. You can eat it all by yourself, or you can break it up and make sure that everyone gets a bite, because at the end of the day, we all want to talk sweet." And I never forgot that. I never ever forgot that, because in its simplicity, it's true. And in my career, especially in IT, I have worked around people that claim to be the smartest ones in the room, and trust me, they're not. They just have a very, very highly developed sense of personal achievement. Like, yeah, God may have created the world, but if He'd given me another week, I would have made it better, type thing. I mean, seriously, these are type of people. And I go and I now I look at people like that and just laugh, but they're just the utter lack of any sort of sense of humility. But the fact of the matter is that that piece of advice has served me well. I always go into a project thinking I deserve no more than 10% at most. Therefore, 90% of it goes to my team. And I also have an adage as a derivative of what he told me as that piece of advice, and that is simply praise in public and criticize in private. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when I'm working on a project team and everything is clicking, I mean, we're hitting our milestones, I am making sure that everyone in the world, and what I mean typically is senior leadership, is knowing how well the team is doing. Now, yes, I'm the project manager, but I'm listing out individual achievements to the individuals by name. And in doing so, I'm making sure that they get credit where credit is due. Because there's also another saying that I learned many years ago. Now, this saying is attributed to Frank Sinatra. And I'm like Sinatra, who doesn't love New York, or really My Way is kind of like my personal anthem when I'm down. But my whole point is that he said that your song is always sweeter when someone else sings it. Now, how true is that? That when you go and you get to those points, it's one thing to say, well, I did this, toot your own horn, and sometimes you have to do that, a little self promotion. But how sweeter is it when someone else goes and says, "Oh, by the way, Al, great job on this thing. I read your update and we are really pleased with your effort." Well, thank you, sir, ma'am. I certainly appreciate that. So, going forward, in this, especially in the announcements that's happened today, and I'm going to focus on one, and that was the announcement of Dan Bongino as being now the new deputy head. He'll be the number 2 at the FBI. He'll be working under Kash Patel, and he was asked to serve on that by not only President Trump, but also the Attorney General Pam Bondi and also Kash Patel. So I think that's a trifecta. I mean, when 3 people say they want you on your team, I think you can take a moment just to say, well, it's a great honor. And I'm going to talk about what Dan's reaction to that was, because it was classic Bongino, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I want to go to right now is just with the idea of this being called to serve. Now, for those of you who may have not, or maybe the first time you're listening to this, the picture on the left is when I was ordained as a permanent deacon within the Latin Rite of the Roman Catholic Church. The man who's laying his hands upon my head was at that time Archbishop Will Gregory, who is now currently a cardinal. He is the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., but now he is retired because he is 80 years old. And under the guidelines under canon law, because he is still a cardinal, he's a cardinal emeritus, but he will not vote if there is an upcoming conclave due to the death of the Holy Father, Pope Francis. We know that he is in a world of hurt, but, no one gets out of this world alive, including popes. But the fact of the matter is that he would not vote in the conclave. He would be invited to come to the conclave, but he cannot actually vote in that. So, in a very real sense, that was a fulfillment of me being called to serve. I was in weekend seminary for over 5 years preparing for this moment. And at that moment, by the gift of the Holy Spirit, he ordained me and left an indelible mark on my soul. And I was then asked to serve the people of God, which I did for approximately 17 years. Well, today, Dan Bongino got a very different call. He did not get a call from uh, his archbishop. I don't even know. I know Dan's a Christian, but I don't know if he's Catholic or not. But I believe he is a Christian. He grew up in New York City, so there's a high percentage that he might have grown up as a Catholic, but I don't know for sure. But instead, what I wanted to do was share these two pictures. And the picture on the left is Dan with President Trump and his beautiful bride Paula, who he loves very, very much. I mean, this is a guy who is in love with his bride. That's another great saying I heard, is that never introduce your wife as your wife. Always introduce her as your bride. I learned that from a gentleman many, many years ago, and I've never forgotten that. And I always go and when I get introduced to other people or whatever, I always go and say, in case if it's my wife's with me, I would go and say, "Oh, this is Bob and his bride, Carol, or whatever." But the picture on the right is when President Trump was on Dan Bongino. Now, the Dan Bongino show, Dan was actually handpicked as a successor when Rush Limbaugh died, I believe 5 years ago. There was a great deal of consternation in terms of who we're going to pick to replace Rush, who would have the gravitas to be able to do that, and the decision was made for Dan Bongino. He started his own podcast with his lovely bride Paula, literally working out of his garage, I believe. Paula did a lot of the technical work and the research, and Dan did the talking. And then as his show grew in popularity, so did his wealth. And I'm sure that Dan Bongino is not going and suffering for lack of money. I'm sure that he has earned a great deal of money, and good on him. I mean, I have no jealousy here. I just, big salute, big props, and off you go. But Dan got a phone call, and Dan now has got to go, and he's made a decision, and he's leaving that other world behind him to once again to serve his country. And I think that when we look at that in terms of doing that at a great deal of sacrifice, now you may think, wow, I mean, that's who else could have ever gone and done that? Well, this is where I find the political class, the talking class, to be as they basically have the depth of an eye drop, literally, and they have no sense of history. And this is where I come in, because part of the talking heads was, well, was Dan qualified to be deputy? He had never been in the FBI. No, the man had been on the NYPD, and he had served as a member of the presidential detail and the Secret Service. To say that Dan Bongino is not qualified to be in this office, first of all, you don't understand law enforcement. You'll never understand law enforcement. And the fact of the matter is that there have been, for example, there have been judicial judges that served as a director. Judge Webster, which I met when the FBI agents had their conclave here in Atlanta about 10 years ago. Judge Webster had never been an FBI agent. He had been a judicial judge, but he was appointed as the head of the FBI, which he served admirably. And from that standpoint, to go and to say that Judge Webster is no less a director than Kash Patel will be, I mean, it's ridiculous. And if these people had any sense of history, it doesn't take much. Do a Google search. Directors of FBI. They'll produce the list. They'll go and they'll show the list. And I wish I had more time to do that. But my whole point is that the talking head class, and they are lazy. They are lazy as hell, because they don't want to do the research. They don't want to do the deep dive. They have no sense of history of this great nation. And to do so and yet talk, all they know is, quote unquote, the present. Well, who talks in the present is a child. A child will always talk, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, whatever. But the whole point is that if they had any sense of history, so let me go and drop, as they say, drop some knowledge on you. Okay? So let me do this. Okay. 99% of most people would not know who this gentleman is. But I do. I do because I was introduced to him when I studied at the Air Force Academy, when we were doing our section on command and control of the military, and how the civilians control the military, not the other way around. But this rather astute gentleman, some would say he was handsome, certainly very distinguished looking. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Robert Strange McNamara. And yes, his middle name was Strange. He was born in the great state of California, went to the University of California at Berkeley, studying statistics, and later went on to go to the Harvard Business School and got his MBA, when a Harvard MBA really meant something. Part of that was also the fact that he also served in World War II working on the staff of General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay at that time was a 2-star general in the Army Air Corps. The Air Force had not been formed yet, and Curtis LeMay's job was to win the war, the air war specifically in the South Pacific. It was Curtis LeMay that went and got his troops ready to go and to firebomb Japan in order to try to bring the Japanese leadership to end the war. He was not successful in that because, unfortunately, the U.S. felt compelled to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan before Japan capitulated on August 15th, 1945. So what makes Bob, I shouldn't be so casual, Secretary McNamara so important? Well, because he had a relationship with this man. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The person on the left is 4-star General Maxwell Taylor, who was the former Army Chief of Staff and would later serve as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy. And then, of course, in the middle was Bob McNamara. Now, Bob McNamara, prior to him accepting the office of Secretary of Defense, or the nomination, had just been selected as president of the Ford Motor Company. He had been the first non-Ford sibling to serve in that. And the story about Bob McNamara was literally he was a human computer. He was also involved in the first original studies of going and putting seat belts into cars. The man was a genius. And he had come to John Kennedy's attention through his brother Bobby. Originally, he had been offered the office of Secretary of the Treasury, but turned it down. Then Kennedy turned around and said, well, then can I put you in defense? Because I'm going to need some help. Now, John Kennedy was going to have a very, very tumultuous relationship with the military, because of the thing we call the Bay of Pigs that went so terribly wrong for him, and because of the fact that he refused to put in U.S. forces to go and bomb Cuba, because he knew that if he did that, and McNamara concurred with him on that, is that then the Soviets would probably move against American forces somewhere in the world, and it would probably be West Berlin, because that was the most western outpost next to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. But Cuba is 90 miles away from the American shores. West Berlin was 300 miles away from the West German border. So Kennedy goes and appoints Robert McNamara because he needs someone to help him control the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, it's interesting that Bob McNamara had a beautiful wife by the name of Marge. This is a scene where Marge is going and participating. This is from the Kennedy Library. But Marge was, in this picture, the young lady there, was the American Legion, and they had the annual Poppy Drive for veterans. But Robert and Marge McNamara had a very, very intense love affair. They were married when they were both students at Berkeley. Marge was, now you have to understand, at the time, um, women, especially cabinet secretaries, did not work. They were tied to their husband's mission. So Marge, like first ladies, Jackie Kennedy had the redesign of the White House. Marge actually had a great deal because her background was in teaching, and she actually um, started the charity that we would know now as Reading is Fundamental, getting books into the needs of kids that were needing a book, especially in the inner cities that didn't have access. She did the fundraising to purchase the books, the distribution of that, and that was kind of her signature charity that she took on. However, being the wife of a cabinet secretary was not easy because while Robert was the head of the Department of Defense for 7 years, he served through not only Kennedy's administration but through Johnson. But Marge developed a very, very severe ulcer because of all of the stress not only her husband was under, but she was under as well. And as a result of that, unfortunately, she died early. And I do have a picture of their gravesite. But the whole point is that, she supported her man, like I'm sure Paula supports Dan. So I wanted to go and raise that because the other thing too, this is I'm sorry about that. Let's go over here. Okay. So at that time, Treasury secretaries were only paid $20,000 a year. And what happened is that if we go and we adjust that for inflation right now, that would be worth approximately $212,000 in today's money. But understanding the President of the United States at that time, now John Kennedy was supposedly he gave away his salary to charity. He did not, like President Trump, did not take a single dime of his presidential salary. Now, President Kennedy was independently wealthy. He received an income from the Kennedy Trust. So, needless to say, he and Jackie were not starving while he was president. But the whole point is that the presidential salary back then, if it was truly now upgraded to the value of inflation, the President of the United States would be making over $1 million a year. The President of the United States currently does not. President Trump's salary is only $400,000 a year, and I believe, like in his first term, he's not taking a dime of it. He's probably going to donate it away. He hasn't announced it yet, but every quarter he would announce that for this quarter, $100,000 would go to some veterans charity, and then the next $100,000 would go to some other charity. But that's his right. He doesn't have to take a salary as President of the United States. Well, the whole point is that McNamara had a very different relationship, and I wanted to go and show this because during World War II, as McNamara was working on LeMay's staff, he was only a lieutenant colonel. Now, a lieutenant colonel was not, that wasn't bad money. It wasn't baller money, but it was, compared to the enlisted guys, he was making okay money. And even the general officers back then were not being paid a whole heck of a lot of money. But the whole point was in less than 20 years, the situation had to be reversed. Now, this is a picture of, I assume it's probably in the cabinet room because of the flags, but I couldn't confirm that. But now here's a picture of Robert McNamara. Instead of him saluting a 2-star general, now this 4-star general is saluting him because Robert McNamara is running the Department of Defense. So the whole point is simply this, is that when we go and we look at McNamara, and in this case with Kennedy, again, the person on the left is Maxwell Taylor, and then we look at Trump and Bongino. So what do they have together? What would they have in common? They're certainly separated by many decades. Well, when you get a phone call from the President of the United States and basically saying, I would like you to serve, you are hard-pressed to turn that down. I will be perfectly honest with you. If I got a phone call on this phone and it said, this is the White House, please hold for the President of the United States, I'm going to hold until my arm gets tired, then my other arm gets tired, then I'm going to figure something out. I'm going to stay on the line until he comes on. and says, Albert, yes, Mr. President, how can I serve you, sir? Or how can I serve you and the nation? And I think that now when Dan made the announcement, if you watch his podcast today, he was very emotional. And hey man, I mean, again, I salute you. You've got solid cred with me. But the fact of the matter is that that choice that he was making to serve his country once again was not only impacting himself. I'm sure he would do it in a heartbeat. But again, he's got a wife. He's got two daughters. One of them is in college, as he said. The other one, I believe, he said is still in grammar school or maybe in middle school. But the whole point is that he's got two daughters. He is going to take a dramatic decrease in his earnings. But again, as he said, that's not important. What is important is the nation. And the fact of the matter is that he loves this nation, as I'm sure Robert McNamara loved his country. He served in the Pacific. He was a veteran himself. And then he gets a phone call from the Kennedy brothers. And the way the story goes is that John Kennedy had a house in Georgetown. And what happened is that the invitees would be invited, but literally came through the back door as not to alert the press. And they would come in and they would have some sort of interview, and then at that point, then they would make a decision. Well, they were keen on Robert McNamara. They were very keen. And as I said before, he'd been offered the Secretary of Treasury. And McNamara says in a documentary, which I watched, again, if the talking heads would just do a little bit of research, okay, everything is online now. You can watch this. You don't have to dig up like they had to do previously. But my whole point is that he did this documentary called The Fog of War. And he talks about, being asked by the Kennedy brothers. And there was a great story that he said, sir, I really don't do Treasury. I mean, I'm a numbers guy, but, I'm not really qualified. I don't know Wall Street. And then John Kennedy says, well, how about defense? We consider defense. And then, he goes and says, well, I served under LeMay in the war, and, that's going to, I don't know if I'm going to be able. And finally, John Kennedy looked at him. And the story is he smiled and he said, Bob, there isn't a school for presidents, but I'm it. And, they both had to have a chuckle, but it was kind of like, I'm asking you to serve the country in a different capacity. Now, again, he had just been named president of the Ford Motor Company. I mean, he was making baller money back then. I mean, he had salary. I'm sure he had stock options. And the rumor is that someone on the Kennedy staff had to go and call the Ford family and basically say, we want him. Can you do something for him? Like when he's out of government service, can he get part of that money back? I don't know what happened. I'm not privy to that. But I know that I'm sure phone calls were made. But at the end of the day, he had to look his president in the eye, or his president-elect at that time, and said, yes, I'm on board. I'm going to serve the country as your Secretary of Defense. And he paid a heavy price for it. He literally paid a heavy price for it. Like I said, his wife suffered from ulcers. He got to a point where he couldn't sleep at night. He would see all of the demonstration of the kids that came. There was a famous protest at the Pentagon. Then there was a gentleman. There was another movie. Alex Baldwin actually plays McNamara. Again, it's online, folks. I mean, do a little bit of research. But this man, he was a Quaker. He drove all up from Pennsylvania. He had an infant daughter with him. He takes the daughter out of the car, puts her to the side. Then he douses himself with gasoline and lights himself on fire in protest what Vietnamese monks were doing in Vietnam. That's what he did. Matter of fact, the North Vietnamese were so enamored with this gentleman, and I forget his name offhand, but they literally created a stamp to honor him, okay? And McNamara witnessed that. He witnessed this guy torching himself. And some people would argue he was never the same again. He finally goes and he gets out of defense. He gets an appointment to the World Bank under Johnson. serves that for a while, and then his life moves on. But I mean, imagine if you were in the balcony, and I believe his office it faces the river. In the Pentagon. There's a thing called the river entrance, and that's where the dignitaries come in. Well, it was on the river entrance that somehow this guy got through. He parked his car, and the child was there, and of course the child didn't get hurt, thank God. But the child was without a father, because he basically said, "You know what, this is it." So the reason why I'm saying that is that if the political class could do some research and try to understand, Dan Bongino is as qualified to be the deputy head of the FBI as Robert McNamara was to being Secretary of Defense. He was qualified because he had an incredible academic pedigree. He had a resume that probably most of us would kill to have. And most importantly, his president, or his president elect, called him and said, "Bob, I need you on my team. I need you to serve the country." And the only responsible answer that he could have given was yes. And I'm sure the same thing that Dan felt, and I'm sure that he and his wife Paula are going to have some conversations. I mean, heck, I would too. But the fact of the matter is that he has tremendous respect for his president, the Attorney General, Ms. Mondi, and Kash Patel. And I think that what really makes Dan dangerous to a lot of people is the fact of the matter is that this guy is a bulldog. This guy, if he goes and clamps on an appendage of yours, he is not going to let go. And I'm sure that once they go and they start doing a deep dive in terms of what the heck was going on with the FBI, you think people are resigning en masse now? There are going to be a ton of people that are going to resign because they're not going to want to deal with this guy. This guy is that important because what Patel has got his mission. Again, understand that what your responsibility is when you're a sub-appointee. So you have the president appoints the attorney general. The attorney general is confirmed by the Senate under advice and consent. Under the attorney general is now the director of the FBI because he too is a political appointee. He too goes through the confirmation process. He gets sworn in. He reports to, I believe, an undersecretary or under assistant attorney general. I don't know if it's a direct one, but I'm sure if Ms. Mondi wanted to change that, she could change that in a heartbeat. The whole point is this, is that now his job is to translate what Ms. Bondi wants as AG, what Kash wants as head of the FBI, and then his job is to make it happen. And he's going to surround himself with people that want to work with him. Because you know what? He's that much of an inspirational leader. And that's what inspirational leaders do, is that they are attracted. They are attractive in the sense that people want to work for people with principles. That's the difference. As flawed as McNamara was, I'm sure that he had those people that wanted to work with him. Certainly he had the confidence of the president. And even after Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, he still enjoyed that reputation with Johnson. Johnson stuck with him. Johnson could have replaced him by virtue, but he didn't, because he knew that if Kennedy had trusted McNamara that much, that he needed to trust him too. Now, over time, that relationship would become strained, but at least in those initial days, Johnson made a calculated decision. He says, "This is the best that I can go with. This is what I'm prepared to do." So again, I would go and say, why is this man going to do this? Well, I'm going to give you two reasons. Okay. The first is the flag, meaning the country. If you've had the privilege to serve this country, you will never look at that flag differently ever again. I remember the first time when I was at the academy. Now, I had been in Air Force ROTC for 2 years in the University of Connecticut. I saluted that flag as much, but it wasn't until when I was sworn in as a cadet at the Air Force Academy. And I remember that first time that we had to we were actually sworn in the field house. So we were standing at attention. Someone made the dumb mistake of saluting, so of course we all saluted, which was wrong because we were not under arms, we were not under cover. We were promptly reminded of that. But I remember the first time that we were actually, on parade in there, and we had our weapons for the salute and the playing of the Star Spangled Banner, and then afterward our first parade. And the Air Force Academy has a huge, huge flag stand. That flag is as big. I'm sure there are bigger flags in the state of Texas, but it's a big enough flag. You can see it for a distance. But the whole point is that, to say, that's when I fell in love with my country. And the fact of the matter is that has never wavered. And now as I get older and know that at some point this flag will decorate my casket, then at least I feel comforted in the fact that that'll be the last reminder that my family will have of me, certainly at my funeral. And what will happen is that flag will be folded up. It will be presented to my wife or next of kin. And with this phrase, on behalf of the President of the United States, we present this flag as a token of your beloved's service to our country. So that's the present. So why do I have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers in there? Are they gone? Yeah, they're gone, but yet they live. Because in that inscription lies, "Here in honored glory is an American soldier known only to God." When you go to Arlington for the first time and you just see those massive waves of white gravesites where McNamara is buried. He's buried on a hill not that far from the Kennedys, actually. He's buried with his first wife, and then he remarried. His second wife is still alive. Unfortunately, he's gone. But the whole point is that, at the grave there'll be three of them. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they're going to do it. But the whole point is that, when you go to Arlington and you just see those waves of white tombstones and know that every single one of them, there's a story that never got to be told to completion. That is really where you would think, certainly in my case, is that I cannot let this country down because they didn't. They made the supreme sacrifice. Not that the political class would have any idea what that means. But let me educate you. It means you gave your life for your country. This life that you could have had, a prosperous life, a life with a wife or a husband and children and grandchildren and friends and church and faith and everything that you would have valued in this life. You gave it up because your country needed you. I'm reminded, I'll tell this as a final story because it is, in fact, I think about it, I get caught up. There was a family in Middle America many, many, many years ago called the Sullivans. And Pa Sullivan worked for the rail yard. He worked as a conductor. And his train went back and forth. Well, he married an Irish lass. And they had over 6 children. They had 5 boys and 1 girl. And the boys were of age. But what happened is then a thing called Pearl Harbor happened. And like many young men, on December 8th, they left their homes and they enlisted in the armed forces, either the Army, the Navy, or the Marine Corps. Well, the Sullivan boys, all five of them, one of them was named Albert. That's the reason why I remember the story so well. But they were all of age, and they went in and they enlisted in the Navy. And they made a condition that was quite unusual. And believe it or not, it had to go all the way to the Secretary of the Navy to get approved. They said, we are going to enlist, but on one condition, that we all serve together on one ship. Well, the Secretary of the Navy, for good or for ill, approved that request, and all five Sullivan boys were trained in various parts of the Navy, but they were on a ship, and I forget the name of the ship. But the name of the ship is not important. But on a summer night, that ship was attacked, and it was sunk, and all five Sullivan boys died. All five of them entered into eternity being together as brothers. Matter of fact, the Secretary of the Navy, after that point, had to rescind that order and issued a new one that no siblings would ever serve together on the same ship. Now imagine being that mother. You're doing your normal household tasks. And then you get a visit by a chaplain and a commanding officer in the Navy that has to personally convey, on behalf of the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy, that all of your sons died together in one single act. The Sullivan boys would later be honored with, I believe, 2 separate ships named the Sullivans, the USS Sullivans. I don't know if that ship is currently in the active inventory of the Navy. Now, did that mother grieve? I'm sure she did. I couldn't imagine why. But she also knew that her sons would not have had it any other way. So when we go back and we look at these 2 men who wanted to serve their country, I feel nothing but tremendous respect for them. I wish I could be one of them. I wish I could serve my country once again. I would do it in a heartbeat. And what's more important, my wife would let me go. She would let me go because she knew that if I got that phone call from this White House and said, I need you to serve your country once again, I'm there. Tell me where you want me to serve, Mr. President. I'm there. And I mean that with all respect and humility. But what I cannot take is this chattering of the political class that he's not qualified, that he's this, he's that, and how could he do that? You know what? This man, just like this man, are going to prove you wrong. You're going to be eating your words. And there's not enough ketchup, there's not enough mustard, there's not enough condiments that are going to be available because you are going to have to eat your words. This man is going to operate honorably. He's going to be a credit not only to his country, but to his family and his faith and everything else he holds dear. But this man is going to be successful. And if you're going to be in his crosshairs, all I can say is either lawyer up, confess, or God help you, because somebody is going to go to jail. And I don't mean that facetiously, and I don't mean that with any sense of sarcasm. Someone is going to go to jail. Because if you have violated the Constitution of the United States, if you had violated your oath of office that you took to be an agent or personnel in the FBI, and you violated it, this man's going to find you. So, for those people that say he's not qualified, yeah, you're entitled to your opinion. I've got mine. But you know what they say about opinions, right? Everybody's got one. Well, I just have a funny feeling that a year from now, my opinion is going to be a little bit more credible, for lack of a better term. Dan, I wish you the best, sir. I know it did not come easy, but you love this country. And it shows. The way you talk about our country, the way you talk about law enforcement and your brothers in blue, the way you talked about the time when you were on the NYPD and the Secret Service, man. But one last story about Dan Bongino, and then I'm going to let you go. Dan Bongino served for 12 years in the United States Secret Service. He served on the Bush detail. He also served on the Obama detail. And there were things that were going on within the Obama administration that it finally got to a point where he couldn't be part of it anymore. So he resigned. He became an outsider. And that's why he did it right. He didn't go and chatter from the inside. He didn't try to undercut because he knew that there was a line that he would not cross. And in order for him to get across that line, he was not willing to pay that price. Nope, not going to have it. So instead, he resigned. He started his podcast. He ran for Congress 3 different times. Didn't get elected, but he ran. I'm sure he and Paul have got more stories than I could even try to entertain you with. But the fact of the matter is that this man is a national hero. He's going to be a national asset. And he is going to be a living proof about the greatness of America. Because Dan came from a hard-scrabbled life. He did not come from a muddy class. Everything that he has earned because of his intellect and his drive and his ability to work. That's something that's lost in America today. Too many people want success too easily, and I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. If you got success too quickly, you did it wrong. You really did. But if you do success the right way, you work hard, and you catch a break every once in a while. Sure. All of us have had that. In my case, if I had a recruiter that was sure, matter of fact, I had applied for a job today. And I actually called the company that in there because we were connected on LinkedIn. I said, listen, I'm really interested in this position. It's based in Atlanta. I believe it was based in Maryland. But I just said, listen, if you could just reach out to the recruiter that's handling that, I would consider that to be a great personal favor. You know what the guy said? Sure. Now, will I get that job? I don't know. There's 100 other people that applied for that job. So the competition is going to be deep. But just in that single act of kindness that may translate into a lucky break. Now, I still have to carry the ball into the goal line. But I feel like now I'm in the red zone. Okay, I'm at the 10-yard line. Well, it's a hell of a lot easier to score a touchdown when you're on the 10-yard line instead of being on the 10-yard line on the other side of the field. Okay? When you got to travel 10 yards versus 90, it's a big difference. But the fact of the matter is, it can happen. And in that case, my search for a job could end within a week, 2 weeks, if I'm lucky, which would be great. But you know what else starts in 2 weeks? Lent. And I've got a lot of things that I've been going through. But I would just like one less burden on my shoulders. Just one less could make all the difference in the world for me. And that's what I'm looking for. Just one lucky break. So, We were coming up on 50 minutes. I'm sorry it took so long, but I love talking. I have a great sense of history, but I also have a great love of my country. And Dan, once again, congratulations. The best of luck to you, sir. And trust me, give me a call. I will work for you in a heartbeat. Take care, folks. Goodbye.